get started with today's event, entitled How to Select an Effective FCPA Training. So as many of you on the line today know, FCPA is probably one of the most important compliance mandates for companies that fall under its application. Training in this area should be a top priority for companies, and the real challenge, though, is training employees such a complex compliance matter, but in a way that doesn't only inform them, so it doesn't only create awareness, but that can truly change behavior within your organization. As a compliance training company, we're of course faced with this challenge every single day, but here at LawRoom, we're lucky enough to have an absolutely stellar legal editorial and instructional design team. So to tackle this topic today head on, we thought the best way to do so would be to bring in our folks and have them share with you how they developed their very own FCPA training. So a little bit about our presenters then. Today with us is Carmen Poole.
Hi.
Hi, Carmen. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Carmen is lead instructional writer here at LawRoom. She's a former humanities scholar, researcher, and educator, and today works with the content team to design and develop our curriculum. She earned her PhD in social justice education from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, and is a certified in adult learning and staff training professional. Also here with us today is Steve Treagus. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Michele.
Thanks for being with us today, Steve. Many of you may have already encountered Steve as a presenter on some of our past webinars, but for those of you who do not know him yet, Steve's a California attorney. He earned his JD from John F. University School of Law and his BA from Sonoma State University. After a number of years practicing employment law, he joined LawRoom as a legal editor. And he currently writes courses for us, monitors litigation, oversees our legal updates, and publishes great blog articles in employment law and in the compliance domain. So thanks again to both of you for being with us today. Why don't we just jump into the topic right away then?
Sounds great. So I guess I'll get us started here. So first of all, we've divided this presentation on effective FCPA training into 3 sections. The first one is an introduction to the FCPA, which is the abbreviation for the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I'm going to also explain why it's important and why you need training to comply with it. Part 2 will be covered by Carmen. That's in which she'll cover the theoretical framework for effective training. And part 3 will both go together on, and we'll each in turn talk about how we apply that framework to FCPA training, and we'll use our own processes of building our online FCPA course as an example. So on the next slide, I'll begin talking about some of the substantive introductory portions. Particularly, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA, has 2 main components. First of all, it prohibits corrupt payments to foreign officials, also known as bribes. And secondly, it demands accurate books and records and internal controls. So it's important to know what agencies enforce the FCPA, and those there are 2 main agencies, and then there's also the FBI. So besides the FBI, it's the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, which I'll be calling the SEC from now on, and the other main agency is the Department of Justice, which I'll be calling the DOJ. So who does the FCPA cover? It covers both U.S. and foreign companies that are traded publicly or that are traded on the over-the-counter market and must file reports with the SEC. It also covers companies that are organized under U.S. law or that have their primary place of business in the U.S., even if those companies are not publicly traded. The FCPA also covers U.S. citizens, nationals, and residents. And finally, it also covers foreign persons and companies that actually are involved in bribery in U.S. territory. So in short, it's likely that it has a very broad scope and it's very likely you're covered. Some key terms are very important to start with, and I'm going to start with the bribery side, the corrupt payment side. So a corrupt payment is a payment to a foreign official which is intended to obtain or retain business. That is a bribe. A payment, and this is really an important key term to focus on, a bribe can be anything, and I mean anything of value. It can be an offer. It can be a promise. So you don't even have to do anything for you to be in violation of the FCPA if the other elements are there. It can also be cash, gift, travel, or entertainment. The list goes on and on. Foreign officials are employees or representatives of any foreign government body or public international agency, or it can be anyone having any tangible connection to one of those bodies or agencies. So as you can see, it's very broad. So on the accounting prong of the FCPA, there's two subparts, which are the books and records provision, and that includes all of the business's books and records. And this is important to note, it's not just books and records that might in some way be related to bribery. It can be any kind of bad bookkeeping. So it's an FCP violation to have bad bookkeeping even if there's no evidence of bribery. Books and records have to be in reasonable detail, accurately and fairly reflect the transactions and dispositions of the business's assets. It's also important to have internal controls that are sufficient to assure that management has the authority over the firm's asset. Again, poor controls can be FCP violations even if there's no evidence of bribery. The FCPA guide, which is put together by the DOJ and the SEC, points out that poor internal controls or weak internal controls can lead to bribes. The payment of bribe often occurs in companies that have weak internal control environments, they said, specifically. So let's talk about its overview and purpose. So it's important to note that the FCP came out of the Watergate scandal in the early to mid-70s. During that scandal, the SEC was investigating and ended up finding that over 400 U.S. companies used millions of dollars to buy interest in the interests of foreign officials and considered it just a cost of doing business. So to try to restore the public trust, the rule of law, and free markets, the FCP was enacted by Congress in 1977, in that dark time after the Watergate era. So let's talk about some collateral damage, so to speak, of FCP violations. So besides just bribery being bad, it has consequences. It raises prices and disadvantages honest businesses. It inflates the cost of business and contracts in developing company. The contracts may be unenforceable. And also, if you bribe somebody once, they may ask for more and more, ever-increasing demands by corrupt officials. And finally, it undermines employee confidence and encourages other misconduct, including self-dealing, embezzlement, financial fraud, or antitrust violations, that is, anti-competitive conduct. So it's important to note that the cost of FCP violations has gone substantially up this year. So far in 2007, corporate settlements are over $570 million, which is more than 4 times the amount of corporate payouts for the entire year of 2015, and we're not even done with 2016. Individual penalties are, and that's, imagine paying that as an individual, right? It's over 42 million, almost 43 million, and the largest single penalty has been 42.5. So as you can see, these are some big consequences. So let's talk about some very specific actions. I chose not to focus on the biggest payouts, but on some ones that have some fairly unique facts that are important to note because you have to watch out for very little things that that might seem mundane. So I'm going to talk about, first of all, Nu Skin Enterprises, which had a Chinese subsidiary. In a few years ago, actually I think this was more recently than that, they faced a $431,000 fine in China for just having a promotional meeting in a city where they had no business license. That was against the law in that place. So what they tried to do to get out of it was they proposed, hey, why don't we donate to charity? You party official, why don't you tell us what we should donate to? And so Nu Skin China thought, well, maybe we better consult with our U.S. parent and with some outside legal counsel to make sure this is okay. But the problem was they only gave those agencies half the story. Oops, we forgot to mention that the payment was meant to influence a party official. So they got bad advice because the advisors didn't have all the facts. The advisor said, it's okay, you can go ahead and make the corporate donation, or the charitable donation, excuse me, but you have to include anti-corruption language in your written agreement. So they made a $154,000 donation to charity, but, oops, no anti-corruption language. So, as an upshot, the party official intervened in the investigation, the charges were dropped, no fine. Nice, right? Well, not really. Nu Skin US had to pay for the subsidiary's misconduct. The SEC charged them with violating the books and records provisions of the FCPA for characterizing the bribe as a donation. The SEC also charged Nu Skin with violating internal controls provisions of the FCPA because they had no reasonable control over their China operation. In sum, it was a $765,000 fine in the U.S. to settle the matter, which was quite a bit more than they would have been fined in China. You would note, too, that as big as that was, it was a discount, because Nu Skin, as soon as they were charged, promptly took action to remediate and to cooperate with the investigation. So what can we learn from the Nu Skin Enterprises case? First of all, a large charitable donation that's mischaracterized violates the internal controls and books records of the FCPA. Secondly, even a single transaction can be enough to trigger an FCPA enforcement action. Next, and this was a big one where Nu Skin China made a big mistake, you have to ensure that compliance personnel know all the relevant facts if you're asking for advice before they sign off on charitable donations outside the U.S. And that's on compliance personnel too. Compliance personnel have to make sure they know, fill in all the gaps. And finally, cooperation and prompt remediation efforts can lessen penalties. And there's a link to our blog that addresses this topic. So let's talk about another enforcement action that has some important lessons. That is the case of LATAM Airlines. In that situation, there are two players that we have to keep in mind. One is LATAM Airlines, and the second is LAN Airlines. Now, LATAM wanted to acquire LAN Airlines. These companies were both from Chile, and they were both on the New York Stock Exchange, which meant that they were covered by the FCPA, of course. So what happened was that LAN paid a consultant $1.5 million, and they told him, go ahead, study some air routes in Argentina where we want business. But it was sort of a nudge, nudge, wink, wink thing. The real reason they were giving that consultant the money was to funnel bribes to a union to avert an organized action against LAN in Argentina. So time goes by. In 2012, LATAM purchases LAN. 4 years later, the Argentine press finds out about the bribes and exposes the company. The DOJ and the SEC get wind of that, and they charge LATAM, the company that's bought Lawn, under the accounting provisions of the FCPA. And the problem is, LATAM failed to disclose, they failed to cooperate, and they failed to penalize the bad actors until they were exposed in the press. So we're going to talk about the lessons learned from this and what happened next. And what happened next was that LATAM had to pay for Land's transgression. So LATAM didn't do any of the bad acts. They bought a company that did bad acts, but look how much they had to pay. They had to pay $22.2 million to settle Land's misconduct. They were forced to beef up their compliance efforts for well over 2 years, and they had to have an independent compliance monitor for at least that time. Next, we're going to talk about the lessons, which are that it's really important that the companies have due diligence for mergers and acquisitions. They need a thorough risk assessment. They also have to apply their code of conduct and compliance procedures to the company they buy as soon as they can. It's also, number 3, important to train directors, officers, employees, agents, business partners, anyone who's going to be doing transactions like this as soon as possible. They need to do FCPA-specific audits as soon as possible, and here's another way, a big way that LATAM messed up: disclose any corrupt payments they find out when they're doing their audits and due diligence. So the FCPA guide, which the DOJ and the SEC put together, as I mentioned, provides leniency, and sometimes they will decline to prosecute companies that follow these steps as part of merger and acquisition. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about what compliance programs are and how they mitigate enforcement. So effective training can prevent an FCPA violation from occurring in the first place. But if a violation occurs anyway, the DOJ and SEC say any efforts to implement an effective corporate compliance program or an improve an existing one can help. An effective compliance program includes training. And that's one of the factors federal prosecutors will consider as a mitigating factor when, as the FCPA guide says, when they're conducting an investigation, determining whether to charge a corporation, and negotiating plea or other agreements. So let's look a little in depth at compliance programs and why they're critical. The FCPA guide says, in a global marketplace, an effective compliance program is a critical component of a company's internal controls and is essential to detecting and preventing FCPA violations. The DOJ and the SEC may decide not to prosecute a violation or may reduce the penalty for corporations with effective compliance programs. So here's what the FCPA guide says, specifically about effective compliance programs. 1, senior management need to be committed to clearly articulated anti-corruption programs. 2, senior execs need to have autonomy and resources to effectively oversee the program. 3, they have to do appropriate risk assessments so that they don't just look at the low-hanging fruit, but they look at their big contracts, the big money makers, and make sure that they have done risk assessment on those. 4, they need incentives and discipline that are appropriate and effective and apply to everyone. 5, they need due diligence regarding third parties they deal with and regarding mergers and acquisitions. 6, they need confidential reporting and internal investigations and guarantees of no retaliation. 7, they need periodic testing and reviews so that programs and trainings evolve along with the business. And finally, I'm going to talk about this a little more on the next slide, but they need effective training to communicate compliance programs. Compliance programs require training because training is how compliance programs are effectively communicated. The authorities look at training when evaluating compliance programs. If the training has not effectively communicated the program, that is, the policies and procedures that ensure the law is understood and obeyed, the authorities are less likely to consider the compliance program effective, which is what this presentation is about. Typically, training covers policies and procedures, the applicable laws, such as the FCPA particularly, and practice with real-life scenarios and case studies. So up next, Carmen is going to talk about how effective training is essential for FCPA compliance and what makes that training effective. So, to you, Carmen.
Thanks, Steve. As a training topic, the FCPA presents a unique challenge. Because it is a course that requires the building of a remedial knowledge base as well as best practices, it was important for us to understand and consider the overall course goals as well as client and learner needs and expectations. In this next section, I'll discuss the ways in which effective training must reach beyond the subject matter in order to consider the whole ecosystem of learning expectations that include opportunities for practical application, the importance of audience type, and their relative level of engagement. In this section, we will also discuss how case-based learning helps accomplish these goals. In 2015, companies spent $702 per learner, and employees averaged 53.8 hours of training per year. Given these investments, if training has shown itself to be ineffective, it is essential that leadership commit to regular evaluations of their current training efforts to identify possible causes. Though there are many culprits for ineffective training, there are three in particular that I'd like to draw your attention to. The first is ineffective overall compliance programs, as Steve had mentioned. This includes policies and procedures. Training is only one part of the overall program and cannot succeed in a vacuum. This is followed by poor organizational culture. If leadership is not committed to compliance and/or the employees do not feel that compliance is valued, training will not succeed. And lastly, where no other programs or internal issues exist relating to culture, bad training itself can be demotivating to otherwise engaged employees. So what's the bad news? Training alone cannot motivate otherwise disengaged workers, and disengagement may actually suggest that there are deeper non-training related problems. These are HR issues, candidate employee quality, culture, and leadership issues. These deeper problems need deeper house cleaning. For example, deeper issues may require redoubling of efforts to shore up the existing compliance program. The good news is that bad training in an otherwise healthy compliance culture with adequately engaged employees is curable. So why does bad training demotivate otherwise engaged employees? In the context of FCPA training, the meaning may not be immediately evident, which is made worse by common check-the-box style trainings. The topic matter can be distancing, especially when there is a strong focus on black-letter law or dry topic recitation and poor delivery. A lack of perceived relevance to a learner's role. Research has shown that instrumental reasons, for example, I need to do this because I've been told that I must, are less motivating than intrinsic goals, such as I want to do this because it will help me do my job better. The goal is to bridge the gap between the training mandate and self-motivation. An engaged workforce has intrinsic motivation to learn from good FCPA training if only they knew it. So part of the goal is to access or instill this sense of responsibility through active engagement, and we achieve this through learner-centric training. Learner-centric training focuses not just on the topic, but it also tailors its approach and method of delivery based on what the learner can learn, determining whether we can actually impart what the learner is ready to learn, characteristics of the intended audience, and the recognition of employees as adult learners, which is absolutely fundamental. Adult learners expect training to provide relevant and useful information, discernible value, a clear mandate and objectives, valuable feedback, which is extremely important, and opportunities to act and reflect. Now, some learners need to unlearn over-competitive behavior. There are other behaviors that need to be unlearned as well, but this, for example, in the FCPA context, the win at any cost in terms of getting contracts, this can lead to misconduct. Experience-based practical training methods are quite useful when trying to engage learners who need to be convinced of its value. and we do this by employing certain strategies to the subject matter. When building the FCPA course, it was important for us to assume that the reader had only a passing familiarity with what it was and knew nothing relating to the law itself. It is also important to assume that on the surface, the subject may seem overwhelming due to its legal-heavy content. When approaching the content, we realized that the law, on its surface at least, was straightforward and would be easy to communicate and demonstrate how problematic practices could be avoided. And we did this in part through case-based learning. Case-based learning encourages experiential and critical thinking skills. It is useful because it can be endlessly tailored to problem solving in any context. It applies to real situations beyond the training, and it gives the learner an opportunity to explore, experiment, and evaluate. Case-based learning reflects adult learning principles because it is realistic. It demonstrates clear utility, which again I'll underscore here for adult learners. It offers the opportunity to act through an experience and not just to passively consume information. That is, the application is not evident. And it offers the opportunity to reflect on content while interacting within a scenario. Besides, who doesn't love a good story? And at least in our case, who doesn't love creating them? Forecasting as a learning strategy is something we employ as part of building case-based learning. Forecasting is defined as creative problem solving that involves envisioning multiple different outcomes or alternative actions. It helps the learner develop and revise plans and backup plans based on multiple considerations to address contingencies or exploit emergent opportunities. When it comes to case-based learning, forecasting, interactive, choose-your-own-adventure style videos integrate multiple outcomes so that the learner can explore the story, scrutinize immediate responses to it, evaluate outcomes, revisit choices and investigate other options, receive feedback at every single turn, and move from content learning to content adoption, which is again something extremely important in the FCPA context. Sense making is also an important part of case-based learning. Its definition is a bit general, but it is the way that we figure out where we are, what we are doing, how we are doing it, why we are doing it, and the purpose and meaning of all of these things. We do this constantly, and it is a fundamental key to learning and comprehension. In fact, every single one of us is doing it right now. It facilitates how we make connections between familiar and the as yet unfamiliar, and this helps us transform newly encountered information into tangible lessons that come alive. Most importantly, it is transformative. It is the opposite of rote learning, and this is what helps change how we do things in our day-to-day interactions. So case studies encourage sense-making by transforming concepts into tangible lessons, cultivating experience via the case, leading learner to retain learning, recognize problems, and apply thoughtful solutions and responses when comparable situations arise. It also instills meaning beyond the module, which is again extremely important when it comes to application. So by way of summary, effective training is learner-centric in that it is customized to the type of learner, which in this case, and in our case, is adults and employees. It is designed to provide immediate feedback at every turn, and it facilitates the learner's process of making sense of the unfamiliar, anticipating and mastering appropriate responses to novel situations. In this next section, we're going to actually take a bit of a closer look at how effective FCPA training is built using case-based learning. And this is where Steve and I will regale you with how we built the training.
Be prepared to be regaled.
Okay. Okay, so how do we build our course? Our courses are the result of very close collaboration of instructional writers and attorneys. We take a great deal of time conducting thorough topic area and educational research that we then reconcile with accurate and up-to-date legal insights.
So when I'm doing the legal research, I look toward actual litigation, which often serves as a basis for interactive case studies in collaboration with the instructional writers, in this case, Carmen as the lead instructional writer. This way, scenarios are realistically based on something that actually happened, and realism provides the adult learner with the sense that they are learning something useful. But our collaboration is great because it's not foolproof.
Right. So in the choosing of the case, in this particular case for the FCPA course, we had a lot of examples of really big cases with huge settlements, and you know, they were quite entertaining and interesting. However, when we looked at the learning objectives and we looked at who our learner was, we sort of came to this understanding that we actually needed cases that spoke to people who weren't in control of $100 million slush funds, who weren't traveling overseas regularly, and who weren't regularly dealing with foreign officials. So we are talking about, you know, employees whose bosses are telling them to backdate stock options, you know, fairly mundane, but also something that is within, it's tangible, and it's realistic for the learner's context.
Right, right. And so the upshot is of choosing the right kind of case studies to turn into case-based learning is that learners vividly realize that the consequences of non-compliance in the situation that really applies to them, it applies based on that situation that they've learned in a similar situation that we found in the legal case.
Absolutely. The importance is that it's applicable. Absolutely.
Right.
This next screen shows a great example, again, of this close collaboration. This is an example of an interaction that I was building called It Grows on Trees. Now, I'm coming at this from, you know, informed by FCPA, informed by the learning, but also informed by the learning objective. And in this particular case, my goal was to build an interaction that discussed or explored the issue of whether or not tribal or Aboriginal leaders were considered foreign officials. And while there's no right or wrong answer to this particular quandary, the fact that it is a quandary, we deemed it as an important learning objective. So I built this initial script, and you can see here Steve's response.
Right, so the original language said Margot was a procurement director for a mid-sized exotic lumber company, and I noticed that the learning objective might not be well communicated if it turns out that the FCPA does not even apply to Margot. So I noticed, and you can see in my note here, I said I don't think there's enough here to tell us she's a resident or citizen of the U.S., and I suggested that the scenario should say something to make that clear. So you can see in the final version there on the left, it now says Margot is a U.S. procurement director. So now we don't have that roadblock to the learning objective. And that's another way we work together and make these things work out.
And these two examples side by side actually show the direction of the corrective. So in the first case where Steve might select a case that might not fit with the learning objective, and then I might inform his research on a case, in this particular case, Steve provided the corrective on the script that I was building by adding more detail that made it far more relevant to the learner and more accurate from a legal compliance standpoint.
Right. Absolutely.
Another thing that we do build here, and another thing that we spend a lot of time on and we're quite proud of, are our branching videos, and this speaks heavily to our case-based learning. These are professionally produced videos that we use professional actors to enhance the realism. The branching scenarios, this is what we call, again, choose your own adventure style, where, you know, there is rhetorical questioning, you know, you may be POV, you may be being asked a question, you may be being asked to help somebody through a dilemma, and each one of your responses will give you immediate feedback and or send you down an alternate storyline that you can explore the consequences of each selection. So again, the multiple outcomes and the novel situations puts the learner in a real position that is low stakes, because obviously it's not real, but it's one wherein they can explore the consequences of their actions.
So we're going to have some concluding remarks, and we're going to just keep talking about this, but we need to put it all together for you because we've covered a lot of ground. So Basically, why is FCPA training so important? Well, first of all, you saw the 2016 penalties have really been increasing. And so effective training is all the more important. Carmen talked about how effective training reflects core principles of adult learning. And we both talked about how FCPA training to be effective builds on these core principles and builds compliance into those principles. So to reiterate, FCPA training communicates compliance, increasing penalties resulting from DOJ and SEC enforcement actions, including the ones that I showed you, the New Skin Enterprises case and the Latam Airline case, illustrate that effective FCPA training is necessary to help prevent costly violations of the law, reduce or eliminate penalties when the law is violated, and in order to communicate the kind of robust compliance program the FCPA guide describes.
And as far as takeaway, absolutely effective training is learner-centric. Legal accuracy and subject matter coverage are givens, and we pride ourselves on that, but effective training needs to go beyond both. For training to be truly effective, your training partner should build their courses on sound principles of adult learning that place the learner's needs and intrinsic motivation at its center. In part, effective training also uses case-based learning. Effective FCPA training incorporates case-based learning, which, as we've mentioned, includes interactive scenarios and choose-your-own-adventure-style videos in cooperation with instructional writers and attorneys to incorporate well-researched educational methodologies and accurate, up-to-date legal insights.
Great. So thank you, Carmen. Thank you, Steve. I think that was awesome.
Thank you.
I believe we have covered definitely a lot of ground, Steve. And I think we provided very interesting insights on, as we set out to do, strategies and best practices around how do you develop a training for something so complex and so important as well as the FCPA. To complete the analysis, we have a few questions that have been asked by the attendees today. I'd like to submit them to you if you're happy to answer them. I think they're a good segue around the presentation, following the presentation. So let me start with the first one. So it seems that in a good program, learning objectives almost always go beyond compliance requirements. So the real question is, how do we identify what should inform the instructional design?
Well, I can speak to the compliance programs aspect of it, and as I pointed out in one of the slides, training is just part of an overall compliance program, but then the compliance program is part of an even bigger picture, which is corporate culture. And corporate culture, really, it has to be beyond just black letter law. It has to just be beyond what is the bare minimum we have to do to comply. And so that leads us to a higher standard. It talks about getting to the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law. And all of that is just to say that by the same token, training needs to be focused on those very human and very important larger goals. So I always bear that in mind when I'm doing the legal aspect of the research and review of our training.
And I'd say from the instructional design or from the instructional writing perspective, to piggyback a bit on what Steve has just mentioned, I think what we're busy doing is deconstructing a bit, because I think sitting through a training has often been constructed as the compliance requirement, which is often why it's taken on the check-the-box sort of utilitarian feeling. In my view, the only way to really further compliance goals is to recognize the fact that the training has to go with the person out the door, which I often call sort of giving it legs. We must go beyond sort of information sharing and work with the person who is consuming the training to help them interpret how, especially in the case of FCPA, how is this information going to be translated and applied on the ground in their day-to-day lives at work. And for me, the best way to do this is to make it engaging, to make it realistic, to actually present real cases so that these, so that the learner knows that these situations can occur, as mundane as they may be, with, consequences, and that certain problems do not have straightforward solutions, so that they'll have to sort of operate on higher order, higher level thinking to sort of think through some of the dilemmas that they might face on a day-to-day basis.
So basically, what we're saying as well is that if the training is successful, we're not providing people with just information, but with a methodology to address, their circumstances and their day-to-day. Great, awesome. Thanks for that answer, both of you. And another question that I thought was interesting, and I think it's connected with the one we just asked, is what do you ultimately have to look for in a training when you need to decide if the standard of the course is really up to par with the objectives that you're trying to train for?
I'll talk about what they mean. I guess it does come down to what is meant by objectives. So there's two ways it could be looked at, and one which I feel happy to address is training or compliance objectives. But if they mean learning objectives, maybe they mean both. So it kind of makes sense for us to try to address both. So it seems like as far as the compliance and training objectives, the really important thing is to communicate. And that's what the FCPA, the DOJ and the SEC say about training. They say that the purpose of it is to communicate the compliance program. So it's to communicate what needs to be done and communicate the behavior that needs to be the conduct. So, and to do that, how do you communicate? Do you just tell them, here, go read the FCPA, go read the statute? No. And you just sort of cut and paste the statute? No. You want to give them some jargon-free ways of looking at it. You have to let them know in plain language and the way that applies to them as learners in their situation what the law means for them. And so I always give a start to that by trying to explain internally in my research memos and whatnot, and then in my review, also making sure that the law is communicated accurately, but that it makes sense and it applies to people. And then as for learning objectives, I don't know, do you want to speak to that?
Sure, and I think this is probably a pretty facile or crude way to put it, but in my mind, the training objective for me, and as you mentioned, if it's comparable to the compliance objective, is essentially what the stakeholder wants. Mm-hmm. So for me, the learning objectives are basically what we need in order to build the content, to build the course that will help us figure out completely internally facing. And, though you have these ideas of outcomes, like what do you want on the other end of this, the learning objective helps us craft, something as simple as a sentence. Does this sentence speak to this learning objective, which needs to speak to some of the training needs?
That's a good point. So it's sort of parallel to the lawyer looking at a statute and understanding it versus what we want the person out there to understand. And then on the learning objective side, you're thinking as an instructional writer, here's my objective, I want them to understand that, but you don't just face that back to them and say, hey, I want you to learn this.
Absolutely. Especially with FCPA when it comes to the books and records. Mm-hmm. I remember, again, great big cases, lots of money, and there was a case that we built about taxi receipts. Mm-hmm. So let's make it mundane. Like, how are we going to, we could put quote unquote, this is what books and records provision states. Mm-hmm. But what does that mean when I'm traveling overseas and I have to keep my receipts and I have to make my expenses and these types of things? So how do we, again, sort of how I think of things, right, how do we make this stuff grow legs and become real, where it's not this ethereal law that doesn't apply to really mundane day-to-day things like receipt collection and...
so you're talking about the scenario, the taxi receipt, you're talking about that scenario where the guy forgets to get a receipt for something like
dinner.
And then he just grabs a blank receipt from the taxi driver and writes dinner on it, or writes it was 2 taxi fees or
Okay. Absolutely. And knowing that this is something that's probably not uncommon, and I think that the connection there is something that common can be and is an FCPA violation. So the FCPA doesn't just cover the quote unquote big wigs with the deep pockets. It affects everyone throughout the organization. And I think, again, as a learning objective, when we're crafting these things, how do we make something like the FCPA, tangible and real to a very diverse group of learners who may or may not be familiar with it, or understand how it applies to their work on a day-to-day.
Right, especially.
Great. So, again, thank you for that. I think that really clarified how important it is to really go deep in the way these trainings are crafted, and there's a lot of thinking that goes into like what can really be relatable for somebody that is sitting on the other side and is taking this training and then needs to go out in the real world and apply whatever they've been learning in that time. So that's great. Another question that I thought that was interesting. I think it's about something we talked about, but kind of we can go maybe a little deeper into it. Is so how important it is to use different learning strategies when doing something like this.
Okay, sounds like one for you, Carmen.
Okay, I'm going to actually take the long way around, but it's also a shortcut, if that even makes sense. But okay, so what was it again? How important is it to use different learning strategies? Okay. Without getting into too much detail, there are a lot of different learning styles, and I'm pretty sure that everyone here and everybody on the line represents one of these, specific styles. There are, let's see, kinesthetic learners, visual learners, oral learners, or logical, solitary, social. I don't know that it's been necessarily agreed upon that there are 7 or 10 or 15, but we do know that there are different learning styles. What is important to note about the learning styles is that none of them exist on their own. Most of us are a combination. For myself, I would be solitary, absolutely, but I prefer text-based. So if I sit down and watch a video, it might not resonate with me in the same way that, sitting down and reading a case or an optional reading in one of our things, that might resonate a bit better. Actually, after the webinar, there's a ton of tests online if you don't know what your learning style is, and they're actually quite fun to discover the best way that you actually learn and gather information. So in terms of the strategies that we talked about, or how we build our learning, it's how do you create content that will speak to the greatest number or the greatest cross-section of the different types of learning styles. So for us, it would be, you have a video, so that works for someone with oral or, visual, but maybe we have text feedback. So then, the text-based learner or, will better absorb that content or be grounded in that text content.
I've noticed we usually have both.
Yes, well, that's it. So again, there's always something going on the page that will appeal and retain the attention regardless of, that's the goal, regardless of your learning style. So, click and drag interactions may have voiceovers. So you have the kinesthetic learner who's moving something, who's interacting with the page, but then your oral learner is getting the voiceover to actually make the connections and give that meaning. And, I guess there are a ton of other sort of instructional choices that have to be made, such as whether we'll use inductive or deductive reasoning based on a particular question or learning outcome. But I think Michele had mentioned it, and I think it's a good point to underscore. There is like this fundamental difference between telling and showing. And the FCPA is a great course for that, where it's like we could have done a telling course. This is the law, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. But really the showing, the acting as though, the working through the problems, the assisting somebody going through a problem in the moment where we're trying to create immediacy, we're trying to create anxiety, we're trying to create concern, to create that embeddedness or that embodiedness in the learning as much as possible, so that they're able to actually gain a sense of mastery when they come out of it. So in this case, we do want learners to behave a particular way within particular contexts. And when it comes to the strategies that we talked about today for case-based learning and forecasting and sense-making, it really just gives us an opportunity to talk to everybody across all of these different styles and needs, be it learner need versus, content need versus stakeholder need.
Great. I love that answer. I think we're almost ready to wrap up here. There were a couple more questions, but we'll probably have to get back to you after the event in a follow-up, even on an individual basis if necessary. So I'm flashing my contacts up on the screen. I wanted to thank all of you that have been with us today. The presentation slide deck will be included in the follow-up email. You'll also receive a full recording of the event. You'll be able to access the resources that Steve and Carmen have embedded throughout the presentation. So those are there for you to consume as well and extend your research on this topic. Lastly, I wanted to say, for those of you who have not had a chance to yet take a look at our courses, we would love to have a chance to show you around the courseware and the training platform. So if you would like to receive a demo, if you could just now type demo on the question box that you've been using throughout the presentation to communicate with us. That's on the right-hand side of the screen. Just type demo. We'll have someone reach out to you. One of our training experts will reach out and show you around our courseware. I guess the webinar is now over for today. I want to thank Steve and Carmen. You've been great.
Sure, it's been great to be here.
And we'll have more of these, so stay tuned with us. And I leave the contacts up there a couple of minutes still before shutting this down. If you want to reach out to me, please feel free to do so. My email is there, my phone number is there, so I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you again, and we'll be seeing you live again in our future events.